So it's already confirmed, Nintendo is working on a Breath of the Wild 2, and we did see footage at E3 2019. However, we did not see any actual gameplay of Breath of the Wild 2. We just seen a cinematic trailer, but even so, this has gotten me really excited for the next Breath of the Wild or the next 3D Zelda game. And in this video, I actually want to go over my top 5 things Nintendo definitely needs to improve in Breath of the Wild 2 that would make it a much more better game. Even if you're a hardcore gamer or not a hardcore gamer of Breath of the Wild, we can all admit Breath of the Wild does have some problems on its hands, and there's some stuff that could definitely be fixed when it comes to Breath of the Wild 2 to make it a much more better experience. So let's start off with my number one most thing I want Nintendo to add to Breath of the Wild 2 that would make it a much more better game in my opinion. Of course, keep in mind these are all my opinions and thoughts at the end of the day, and we all have our own opinions here. But anyway, the number one thing I want Nintendo to actually add to Breath of the Wild 2, which would make it a much more better game in my eyes, would actually be RPG elements. Yes, I actually want RPG elements in a 3D Zelda game, because I don't think any Zelda in history has gotten a really in-depth RPG elements, and by adding really in-depth RPG elements, I think it would give the game much more depth. I also think it would give it much more replayability and things like that. I definitely want better RPG elements, and I know Nintendo could deliver it if they really wanted to. For instance, I want Link to have stats this time, and I want him to have reasons to fight enemies, because as you know, in Breath of the Wild, when you go fight enemies, there's really no reasons to actually fight enemies. Maybe if you want equipment from them, or maybe some supplies from them, but for the most part, it's really hard to justify killing enemies after a while, because what's the point of killing enemies if you're not leveling up, not gaining experience, and things like that? So I definitely want Nintendo to add RPG elements to Breath of the Wild 2. I actually understand why Nintendo didn't add in-depth RPG elements to Breath of the Wild. The main reason they didn't do that is because I do know for a factor when it comes to Breath of the Wild 1, Breath of the Wild 1 was a game that Nintendo actually wanted to cater to two different types of gamers. They wanted to cater it to the much more casual gamers and the much more harder gamers, and since they had to cater this game to two different types of gamers, they didn't really want to put hardcore RPG elements in the game, because they didn't want to make all those mechanics confusing to gamers that don't play games on a regular basis and don't understand hardcore in-depth RPG elements. But I think since Breath of the Wild 1 has finally come out, I think it's time to Nintendo to take this game a step further and actually start going into much more hardcore territory, if you can even call it hardcore territory. And I personally would love RPG elements in the game. This also goes to the actual fighting in the game as well. I think the fighting mechanics in the game are a little bit too generic for my taste. At this point, all you're doing is pretty much mashing a button, and there's no combos, no nothing you can do with the swords in the game. So give us better fighting mechanics in the game alongside RPG elements where everybody has a different unique Link, because they can change the stats on Link. Link levels up, Link grows, you can get different stats and things like that. Just overall more in-depth RPG element to the game. I absolutely would like that, and like I said, it would give it more replayability, give it more depth. Overall, that's my number one thing I want in Breath of the Wild 2. Now, my next thing I definitely want in Breath of the Wild 2, which I think a lot of people will agree on, is the fact that I do want better dungeons. I think it's time, because after Breath of the Wild 1, you guys know Breath of the Wild 1 really didn't deliver when it comes to the dungeons of the game, and I really feel like Nintendo could do a much more better job by having better dungeons in the game. As you guys know, we do have the 4 Divine Beasts. Those are the 4 main dungeons in the game, and I get why they're not that good, because they did have to focus on these mini dungeons called shrines, and since there's over 100 mini shrines or mini dungeons in the game, of course they had to put a lot of their work or a lot of their attention to all those mini dungeons or mini shrines. So I get it, but now it's finally time for a sequel, and they really need to deliver. And if they're really going to deliver something much more better than Breath of the Wild 1, I really think that they need to focus on the dungeons of the game. Give us better dungeons, give us better boss battles in the dungeons as well, because if you look at the history of Zelda as a whole, whether it's 3D Zeldas or whether it's 2D Zeldas, almost every other Zelda game in recent history does have better dungeons than Breath of the Wild, and I think most people can admit that. So if you fix that right there, I think it's going to improve the quality of this game so much by having better dungeons. Now, the one thing I do want in this game, definitely that would give this game make this game much more better, is if in Breath of the Wild 2, if they gave us much more better enemy variety. Please give us better enemy variety. As we speak right now, there's not too many different types of enemies, and as you play the game and as time goes on, as you're playing the game, you realize there's not that many different types of enemies in the world, and eventually it becomes stale and it becomes boring, and you eventually learn all these different enemy patterns and enemy fighting styles and things like that. So I definitely think it's time for Nintendo to add more enemy variety to the game. That's personally what I would want, so the game would feel less stale, less boring over time. Please add more enemy variety. They can add new enemies to the game never before seen in a Zelda game, or on top of that, they can add past Zelda enemies, because there's some Zelda enemies which you guys know that's never been used in Breath of the Wild. For some reason, they just left them out of Breath of the Wild. So just give us more enemy variety as we're roaming the world, as we're walking around the world. I think it would improve the quality of life in this game, and this game would have much more better variety if they added more enemies. The next one I actually do want, which I think some people want as well, I actually want meaningful side quests. Please, Nintendo, give us meaningful side quests when it comes to Breath of the Wild 2. I would absolutely love that. As we speak right now, a lot of the side quests in the game are mediocre, are just pointless. You don't really want to go out of your way to actually do these side quests and talk to these NPCs. Fix the NPCs first so that we actually have some pretty memorable NPCs, and then make the NPC side quests much more better. Make them better. Not to say that there's not some fun ones in Breath of the Wild. They're all not junk, in my opinion. There are some good side quests in Breath of the Wild, but more than likely, most of them are more boring than actually memorable and actually fun to do. So if they improve the side quests in the game, actually give us reasons to actually play them, whether it's NPC interaction, whether it's the task at hand, or whether you give us an actual good reward for completing these side quests, I think more people would want to do the side quests. And it's not just Breath of the Wild that has that problem. It's a lot of open world RPGs, or RPGs in general, which have pretty bad NPCs or pretty bad NPC side quests. So if you fix that in this game, it would give this game much more replayability, and also just make overall the quality of life in this game shine. And then the next one I actually want Nintendo to actually improve on, I actually want them to actually improve on things to do in the world, because as we speak, if you play this game over time, you start to realize there's not that much to do, whether you believe it or not. After you play this game for a while, you start to realize that the world is really boring, there's not too much to do in the world. You're pretty much just walking around in these open fields for hours and hours on end. And honestly, I think Nintendo should deliver and give us much more things to do, because after a while, it really does start to get stale and really does start to get boring as you're just roaming around these areas. What's really the point of fighting enemies? Fighting enemies gets boring after a while, and there is some like little mini games you can play throughout the world. There is some stuff you can do. I'm not going to say Breath of the Wild is totally dry, because that's clearly not the case. Breath of the Wild is clearly not a dry game, but they can definitely take it farther and make sure this game tends to not get boring. And you don't want to be running through open fields for hours or even minutes without anything to do and it getting stale. So if Nintendo actually changes that and gives us more things to do in the world and gives us things as we're walking around that we see and that we can actually do, I think this game would be a much more better game. But anyway, guys, those are just my top 5 things I want Nintendo to improve on when it comes to Breath of the Wild 2. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.